American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 13, The Presidency. The learning objective for this segment is to understand the formal presidential roles and their effect on political and public policy outcomes. When we consider all the roles played by the president, as head of the executive branch, there are multiple different roles, and these include the chief of state, the chief diplomat, the commander-in-chief, the chief of party, the popular leader, the chief legislator, and the chief executive. So let's take a look at them each in turn. When we're looking at the role of chief of state, what we see is that in most cases, in most political systems, especially parliamentary systems, there's a separation of the ceremonial and symbolic head of state from the political head, and this allows for the better carrying out of policy. However, in the United States, the president performs the role of both symbolic and political head, and thus uses the power of the office to exert influence in very much a symbolic way. For instance, the presidential seal, the U.S. flag, Air Force One, all have emotional connections with most people, and they are influenced by them. Rather subtly, but it is a form of influence that is a long-lasting influence. As chief diplomat, what we find is that within the Constitution, this power is not specifically conferred upon the president. However, the POTUS is more capable in this role than is Congress. Now, this is due to the staff, the information flow, and most importantly, especially in our modern era, the ability to make swift decisions. The president is authorized by the Constitution to receive foreign ambassadors and to appoint ambassadors, so that is a specific role that the president does play. Now, here we see that Article 2, Section 2, authorizes the president to make treaties subject to the ratification by two-thirds of the Senate. In other words, it's both of the parties, and there's a check and a balance in foreign entanglements. However, there are executive agreements, which are legal contracts between two nations, and this does not require two-thirds approval from the Senate. And what we find is that in modern days, this accounts for 90% of all international agreements. So in looking at Figure 13.5, we see that there has been a movement away from treaties and towards executive agreements, so that prior to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there was a tendency to have treaties, whereas in recent years, with the executive powers becoming more preeminent in dealing with a very complex world, executive agreements have taken over a greater proportion of activity in this realm. Now, as Commander-in-Chief, the President is in charge of all branches of the armed forces: the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, and the Coast Guard. Perhaps most important, especially for this country, is the idea of civilian supremacy over the military. This is a hallmark of democracy, that the military is there to serve the needs of the general public and not the other way around. However, what we do find is that in times of emergency, specifically threats from foreign nations, the public follows the president automatically in what is referred to as the rally around the flag effect. Now, within research that I've carried out, this happens not just automatically in that there's a threat, you automatically turn to the leader and follow the leader. It's actually in response to the leader stepping forward as a leader. And what we see is that going public does matter, and that most of the times when we're dealing with public approval in response to threats, that there is actually a very strong uptick in public approval ratings. And we see this not just for George Herbert Walker Bush with the Desert Storm, but also for George W. Bush in response to the terrorist attacks. And certainly we've seen it over the years with Ronald Reagan and with Bill Clinton. Now, as Commander-in-Chief, there are constraints, and most recently what we've seen is the War Powers Resolution, which was passed in 1973 in response to what was seen as overreach by the executive branch in going to war. And indeed, in response to Richard Milhous Nixon, who was president at the time, Congress passed this over his veto. So in looking at this, what we see specifically is that within 48 hours after committing armed forces to combat, the president must report to Congress in writing explaining the circumstances and the scope of actions. In other words, there must be information that is flowed when there is the use of the military. Now, beyond that, we have the use of American forces in combat needs to end in 60 days unless Congress authorizes a longer time period. But the deadline can be extended for another 30 days if the president certifies that that time is necessary for the safe withdrawal of the forces. In other words, if you go to war, you actually have to leave the battlefront effectively. Lastly, within the 60 or 90-day period, Congress can order an immediate withdrawal of American forces by adopting a concurrent resolution. Now, this is not subject to a presidential veto. So what we see here is that Congress has the ability to set the military into combat, but also remove them. Now, chief of party is more of an informal thing, but it reflects the fact that as president, the president is the winner of the highest office and is the premier individual in the party. As a result, as chief of party, the president must be able to lead the party and lead public opinion, which in turn relies upon understanding it. So the president needs to be sensitive to change within public opinion, as well as know the limits of what actions can and cannot be taken. And tied in with this is we often see the president campaigning for congresspersons, and this is a way of bringing public attention to the congressperson that's running for office and hopefully affecting public opinion positively. Now, sometimes it can be seen as a negative, especially in certain districts where there might not be support for the president. Now, tied with this, and beyond being chief of party, the president is the popular leader. The president represents the nation as a policy leader, and the presidency is a place for symbolic leadership. In the words of Teddy Roosevelt, he referred to it as a bully pulpit. In other words, people look at you, they follow you, and this is by definition what a leader is, someone that people look to. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it, the presidency is not just an administrative office, but is preeminently a place of moral leadership. In other words, the idea is that we look to our presidents to provide moral leadership as the country moves forward, although there are certainly questions as to what exactly this moral leadership is and what form it takes. The president is also the chief legislator. As part of the checks and balances, the president gives information in the State of the Union address. While the president does not directly involve him or herself in legislation, there is active participation since the 1950s by setting the agenda in front of the public. And this is the use of television that makes it so powerful, is because so many people are watching. Now, the president also has executive privilege, which is the right to withhold information from the Congress and the judiciary. Now, this is an implied power, and this is seen as due to the president's need to act effectively. The president also has a veto power as chief legislator, and this is the refusal to sign a bill into law. Now, what happens here is if there is a demand to pass this law, there's a need for 2/3 of both the House and the Senate vote to override it. But there's also the possibility of the pocket veto. Here, the bills are held for 10 days, automatically pass. However, if Congress adjourns during the 10-day period, the president can kill the bill by taking no action. Finally, the president is the chief executive. In other words, the president runs the executive branch, which is the implementation function. So the Constitution vests power in the president so that the laws be faithfully executed. The president has to execute the laws. So while the president tends not to be involved in the minutiae of governing and is mainly involved in crises and big decisions, he is still responsible for the implementation and the administration of law. Now, the president also has, as chief executive, the power to grant reprieves and pardons, which is something that goes back to the power of kings. Now, the president also has power over 14 cabinet departments and about 60 independent agencies, boards, and commissions. So by the hiring and firing of around 4,000 upper-level federal executives, in other words, the Plum Book, in conjunction with Senate approval, the president has an awful lot of power over how legislation is carried out and how it's interpreted. So what we see here as chief executive, there is an awful lot of checks and balances, whether it's through granting reprieves and pardons, and this is the influence on the judicial branch, or through the actual carrying out and interpreting of law, which of course influences the legislative branch. American national government.